if those aren't in place when handwriting instruction, not necessarily when before handwriting instruction begins, because we don't get to that misconception that sort of these can't also sort of develop in a sort of reciprocal nature as handwriting instruction begins. They absolutely can. But there is a lot going on in terms of what children need to be able to do. And all of that stuff is before you think about, well, most children, they have a little bit of handwriting, but it's pretty much writing to learn straight away instead of learning to write. If I can sort of make that analogy as often is used with reading.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Neil Almond.
Hello, Kieran. Good to be here.
It's great to have you back, Neil. It's been a long time.
Feels like it's been a while.
You no more than 13 weeks ago, you probably did the CPD session for us, but I'm trying to think when the actual last interview was. But something that's been on my mind, I suppose, my whole way through my career, because my handwriting is terrible, is handwriting. Kids struggle with it. Adults struggle with it. It biases our interpretation of writing assessment.
Yeah.
And yet we don't really know much about it. And luckily, you've done the reading so we don't have to, and the research into handwriting. And so I'm really excited to chat with you about that today. But first, Neil, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So, very new study of literally 2 days ago, the publishing date, and it is a real-world test of artificial intelligence infiltration of a university examination system, a Turing test case study. So people may have seen this one on the Twitter sphere, but this was effectively the researchers who at Reading University put in for used generative AI to effectively try to pass a bit of coursework for a psychology degree, and basically 94% of the submissions went undetected, and of those grades that were awarded, they were on average half a grade boundary higher than those achieved by real students. So this was obviously not like an exam, it was a bit of an essay that you'd have to do after attending a few lectures. So it really kind of does make an interesting case study as to what does assessment look like. My role sort of pivoted from schools to teaching school hubs in the kind of last year, and obviously, a big new feature of the new NPQs is that it's not like a little research project. It is effectively an open exam, and so there's some interesting repercussions, I think, for the new wave of NPQs as well. If you get given, for those that haven't, you get given a question, you get given a case study, lots of made up data, and effectively you're asked to produce an action plan, explain why you've chosen what you've done based on the evidence pack that they provide you. And so it takes someone who knows how these AI systems work, it takes like 3 minutes to upload all of those documents onto an AI a bit of tech or AI software and write a prompt about how it needs to answer this specific question. So that could be your whole NPQ done. So yeah, really interesting that at the university level, like, this stuff is getting through.
Claude 3.5. I was reading your newsletter.
Yep.
Teacher prompts.
That's the one.
Was it last Tuesday? You said the Claude 3.5 can work at graduate level now?
Something like that, yeah.
So you could put in the mark scheme, maybe if you don't get the mark scheme, that's the only. Are you certain you could put in the learn tos and learn how to statements, put in the prompt and all the case study materials as PDFs, give him an instruction, give it an
Yeah.
instruction, and you wouldn't be far off because there's quite a big gap from the top to the bottom of the mark scheme, no matter which provider you're with. That is that's a real real thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting time to be in education, I think, if you are on a course that sort of relies on, I know it doesn't apply that much, certainly not to primary, and very less so to English schools in terms of the lack of coursework that is generally available to them, and how it is all about that sort of last, that final exam. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see if other countries sort of have to pivot back to the old, maybe even handwritten exam to respond to the case that, not only can people not detect this, but it is fundamentally producing higher quality work, and that's in sort of air quotes, higher quality work than students on the actual course as well. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
I have been reading a post by Gareth Metcalf, and it's about deconstructing word problems. And essentially, for a while, I think he has had some resources where he sort of breaks down problems into their component parts and sort of builds up slowly through a really carefully sequenced set of questions. And to my knowledge, they're only available for year 6 at the minute. But he's got a really interesting blog post about almost the reasoning behind that. And I think I'm going to tag it in the show notes and in the description, because I think Gareth's onto something. And he likes to test things in classes with real life pupils and teachers and stuff. So that he spent a lot of time thinking, a lot of time exploring these, and well worth checking out.
Yeah, sounds really. I mean, obviously, if anything that Gareth writes about the deconstruction of problems and how to solve them is going to be worth a read for sure.
This week, we're going to chat about handwriting. You have spent an inordinate amount of time researching or reading the research into handwriting. Has the chapter been announced? Do people know that you have authored a chapter in the Research Ed Guide to Primary? Is it that was called?
Research Ed Guide to Primary Literacy. And yes, Stephen Lockyer, who is the series editor, announced on Twitter a good couple of weeks ago now what that structure is going to look like, and who's written chapters about what. So yeah, there's a flavour out there that I've done a chapter on handwriting, which is really exciting. As you say, it's been a labour of love, I think, for the last I think I've dropped on the podcast previously that I've been reading a lot of research about it. So yeah, looking forward to that being available for people to buy, and looking forward to taking this as my talk for Research Ed for the 24-25 academic year.
Nice, yeah. Fleetwood Mac have split up the variation talks on ice.
I was going to say, and until we either need to do like the comeback tour because the funds have run out, on our separate ways for now.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing that talk and looking forward to reading the chapter. In fact, all the chapters. But I thought I'd start with almost sort of setting the scene. Is handwriting important?
But in a nutshell, yes, it really is still incredibly important. So the first part of the chapter kind of sets that scene of, now that we're in the 21st century, and we can use a keyboard, we can use text to speech. Is there actually still a benefit to teaching children how to handwrite? And I think that is generally an important question, because everyone knows how time poor teachers are and how much there is in the curriculum. So if we could say, we could not teach handwriting and it's not going to have any detrimental impact on student achievement, then great. We've earned ourselves a bit more time to focus on a few other things. But it seems to be from the research, and again, looking at quite a few sort of different areas and different domains of research, that um, handwriting still has a particularly important role to play. So, there's research from cognitive psychology around handwriting, but also a lot of neuroscience. Now, I can't claim to be a sort of an expert in this regard, but some real sort of interesting sort of like MRI scan sort of research that to suggest that children who are so pre-literate, so usually around the ages of 4 or 5, when they sort of hook them up to these sort of MRI machines and they get them to do a keyboarding task versus a task that requires to be handwritten, so try to write out some letter shapes. You do see a lot of the brain activity that is connected with literacy, does something different when those children handwrite something over to in comparison to keyboarding. So there's, again, seems to be something going on a neuroscientific level about how those connections are made between what the sound and the representation of that sound and how that's communicated in handwriting, which I think is, really quite interesting. And again, we see that with children at 4 or 5. We also see that at older children who are around sort of 12 years old. So I'm not quite sure the pronunciation of this one, but we got OS in 2020 conducted some brain activity research with 12-year-olds while they were writing in cursive or drawing or sort of typing a word, and that when they were drawing or writing, the regions of the brain associated with memory and for encoding new information were synchronized, but when typing, these areas of the brain were actually like desynchronized. And the authors actually conclude that children from an early age must be exposed to handwriting and drawing activities in school to establish the neuronal oscillation patterns that are beneficial for learning. So there is that sort of neuroscientific way that kind of works on a level that teachers sort of aren't necessarily fundamentally aware of. But we also have like a sort of more cognitive sort of scientific domain that we can go to as well. So this is Malpeque et al. In 2023 in a study of 6,000 pupils between kindergarten to year 6. So that's our year 1 to year 7. They were looking at the impact of the writing modality on reading and writing performances, and basically the results revealed that handwriting significantly correlated with better quality passages when compared to having to do things with a keyboard. Now, the evidence around should you use a keyboard, should you use handwriting, there are some sort of contradictory examples sort of in there. However, nothing so out of the ordinary that makes us think, yeah, we should definitely we should take that leap and say, we shouldn't teach handwriting. We should definitely, let's just go straight to teach them how to use a keyboard. Let's get them quick typing quickly. Let's just use text to speech. So yeah, there is sort of a lot of evidence out there, I think, that does seem to suggest that, teaching handwriting is really, really important for particularly, our youngest children at that time when they're just beginning to become literate, so they can make those associations in their brain.
That is pretty conclusive. I remember David Adama maybe mentioning the link between handwriting and memory before. So yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, in my experience, children are also just as bad at using keyboards as they are at handwriting. So I've never seen anyone successfully learn to touch type.
No, most adults still aren't there. I still see quite a few adults of our age who are still fundamentally the pointerless typer, where it's literally one finger on each hand and it's just a stabbing motion.
I'm in the process of training myself to the copy, paste, and delete functions. On the Mac they are Command CV, be
Yeah.
all quite close to each other, but I still will move my index finger to control that. And what I'm trying to do is trying to make sure that my other fingers get involved. So ring finger for command, middle finger for copy, index finger for thing. But I digress. What's the weirdest thing or the strangest thing someone has researched about? What, like, because I know you've got a lit map set up that lets you know about everything in the field of handwriting because I get emailed about it. What's the strangest thing that crossed your desk whenever you were doing this research or this reading of the research?
It's one of those areas where when I started this, I genuinely didn't think that it would, not that it wouldn't take that long, but that there wouldn't be much out there in terms of research. But the amount of research that is out there with regards to handwriting was, really quite surprising, and obviously in a good way, and I think in a way that's going to be sort of really useful for educators. So in terms of anything like massively surprising in the sense that, oh my god, like why would you think of like researching right hand versus left hand, writing upside down? Not much of that, but really interesting stuff in terms of we think we have a pretty decent idea as to when handwriting instruction should begin. And now that's not necessarily something that I thought we'd ever find. How will we know if children can actually they're at that point where all the prerequisites that are needed for them to be able to write effectively are in place, and it all comes down to effectively what's kind of the visual motor integration, which is literally motor moving, visual, are they moving and can they see things and is that all connections, are those all kind of synced up? And so there is actually an assessment out there that people can use if they want to measure when children are ready for handwriting instruction. And effectively the point of them being ready is when they can do a oblique cross. So the kind of the classic cross that you might use to represent a kiss in a text message, for example. If children can do that, then that is a sort of seems to be a highly useful proxy to say that these children, all the kind of the visual motor systems that are needed to sort of link up for handwriting instruction to be effective, they are going to be able to cope with all of that stuff at that point. The other really sort of interesting bit, and something that again I wasn't aware of at all until I started reading this, was all the research around handwriting grips. So sort of all my experiences of teaching handwriting and sort of knowing about what I thought I knew about handwriting, it all sort of came back to this idea, well, if it's not a tripod grip, don't you dare try to teach them anything unless they are doing this sort of what I've come to know is to be called the sort of dynamic sort of grip. So if they're not doing that, then don't even bother. It turns out in research that's really not the case. What they tend to do is kind of classify grasps as to those that are called sort of immature grasps, which is where you might sort of place the pencil or pen in like the palm of your hand and sort of grip your palm, your hand together like that and start writing like that, for example. Or you have this whole sort of collection of what they call mature grasps. And the research seems to suggest, well, as long as your pupil is demonstrating a mature grasp, so that could be sort of the dynamic sort of tripod grip, which is sort of the classic, the pencil sort of is on your thumb, middle finger, and sort of index finger. But there are other grips as well within the mature grasp that actually are perfectly acceptable for children to handwrite. So again, thinking back to my own practice and just how much I spent, children who probably did have grasps that were absolutely fine for handwriting, but we spent a considerable amount of time trying to get them out of the habit of the grasp that they were in, despite the fact that it being really quite a acceptable grasp for them to begin, or acceptable grip for them to carry on with their handwriting instructions. So I think that's, for me, those two things: the fact that we have some sort of definite indicator as to when their visual motor integration is at the point where handwriting instruction can begin through the creation of the oblique cross, and the fact that despite the national curriculum and the early learning goals sort of emphasizing this sort of dynamic tripod grip, it's not necessarily the case that it needs to be so. Now, obviously, as teachers, you're going to just choose a grip and teach it. And if the national curriculum says tripod, then we'll teach them tripod. But if you've got children in year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6 who have had, 2 or 3 years of holding a pen or pencil in a particular way, as long as it falls within that sort of mature grasp category, then you don't have to spend your time getting them to unlearn those habits that they've accumulated over 3 years every time they've picked up a pencil or pen, which across their schooling time is going to be a phenomenal amount of time. So yeah, those are the two sort of most interesting things that I've come across that I think are actually really useful for educators to know.
Yeah, they're fascinating. I mean, they're the kind of things I would have liked to have known when the boys were young. Because obviously, having my maths head on, I knew when supertizing was likely to come along. I also was aware of when they develop sentience in terms of they can recognize themselves in the mirror. I think around about 18 months, most children. So I would frequently hold them up to the mirror and go, "Who's that? Who's that?" So that handwriting, can they draw an oblique cross? Would have been on my list of things to do during the pandemic.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Did you manage to get a diagram with the acceptable grips in the book?
So yeah, a lot of that research around grasps comes from some researchers over in America, led by a professor called Professor Donica. I reached out to her to be like, basically, I just want to screenshot this because I think it's really fascinating, and I think it will be really useful for educators in the U or in England, and hopefully the wider UK, because we are sort of confined into thinking it has to be dynamic tripod. So she very kindly agreed and said, or checked with the publisher of the paper, and they said, as long as it's all referenced correctly, it's absolutely fine. So yeah, there's definitely going to be a really useful graphic, I think, about these different kind of grips in that book, which I hope people will find interesting and be a useful discussion point. What's really nice about it is, to say, it's images of the grasps and the grips themselves with a description of what children are actually doing at that point. And again, of those sort of the researchers who looked at these particular grips as well. So if people want to find out more about them, they can do as well. So something for everyone.
The question that's probably on everyone's mind is, why do children and adults find handwriting so difficult?
Handwriting itself, or the writing sort of process, is an incredibly complex thing that you need to do. So again, Professor Donica sort of references, and again, I have this was also sort of allowed to be published in terms of like some of the underlying sort of prerequisites that are required. So in terms of the motor skills, children need to sort of have that visual motor integration, that fine motor skills, that tool hold. They need to understand the paper position. They need to have the ability to sort of trace and copy. In terms of neuromuscular skills, they need to have sort of postural control, muscle tone, upper extremity stability. Then you've got sensory motor skills, so that's understanding motor planning, more visual perception, sort of kinesthetically understanding what's going on. With sort of cognitive skills, then there's sort of be able to sort of recall what you're doing. Directionality is a massive one. Knowledge of letters themselves. In certain cases, sort of number knowledge, because it tends to be like there are sort of 3 main movements for this. It's one movement up, one movement to the side, and then curl it around, or whatever it might be. And so there are fundamentally so many underlying prerequisites that are needed for handwriting that if those aren't in place when handwriting instruction, not necessarily when before handwriting instruction begins, because we don't get to that misconception that sort of these can't also sort of develop in a sort of reciprocal nature as handwriting instruction begins. They absolutely can, but there is a lot going on in terms of what children need to be able to do, and all of that stuff is before you think about, well, most children, they have a little bit of handwriting, but it's pretty much writing to learn straight away instead of learning to write, if I can sort of make that analogy, as often is used with reading. And so because we don't give children the sort of cognitive capacity to actually fully learn to write first, and sort of we go too far into the sort of the text generation in terms of we need to get an output out of you quickly because of whatever outside pressures there may be, then actually generally it's because we haven't given children that time to develop their handwriting practice, and then because we haven't done that, they sort of develop poor habits. Those habits sort of then become ingrained and difficult to move them on. But I think it's important that when we're saying good handwriting, like, we need to not get caught down that rabbit hole of neatness is equivalent to sort of good handwriting, although there is a fair bit of research to suggest that neatness is important. So there's lots of studies done in America all around what is known as the presentation effect. So the kind of first reference that I can find for this comes from Graham, Harris and Herbert from 2011. And that comes down to the sort of, when it comes to the assessing of handwritten work, because of the fallible nature of humans, we assume, if we see messy work, then therefore the ideas and the text generation and the quality of that work is somehow of poor quality as well. And so it really is sort of having to train ourselves to think, well, just because this handwriting isn't beautiful and perfect and lovely doesn't mean that the ideas behind it that they're trying to communicate necessarily are either. So that was a really interesting one for me, certainly in terms of having been a year 6 teacher for quite a long time and moderating and all of that stuff. It's I've probably definitely fallen foul of going, oh, they haven't got great handwriting, so it's probably not very good, versus the child who has very legible, neat handwriting. And again, that's a distinction that needs to be made between handwriting needs to be legible, doesn't necessarily mean to be neat, so we need to not confuse those two ideas together. But it certainly does seem to be a massive bias against those that have sort of poor handwriting. So again, another reason why handwriting is so important still, particularly in primary schools. Very rarely do we give pupils the chance to sort of do a complete bit of work on a computer, and these things do have a massive impact. The amount of handwriting, particularly in England, because England we tend to sort of teach print, and then we sort of teach cursive as well. So effectively the amount of sort of mental representations for that letter, for each letter, there are 4 that they need to learn. So uppercase cursive, lowercase cursive of the whole alphabet, uppercase print, lowercase print that they need to learn for the whole alphabet, because that's what that's the nature of what how our schooling system is set up and what the national curriculum says. So I think I've worked it out here. It's about 104 representations of different letters that children need to sort of learn, which when you're 3 and 4 years old, that's quite a lot of representation. Obviously, you're not going to do hopefully you're not doing the cursive straight away, but it is still a lot for young children to learn. And then you have to add in the element, okay, well, just because they know that representation, they then need to get fluent at that representation as well. And flow that into then, other letters to create words and all of that sort of stuff. So it's just because when you spend that time thinking deeply about what, pardon the pun, when you spend that time thinking deeply about what goes into handwriting, you do realize that there is a massive amount of knowledge and ability to be able to do that. And I think we don't necessarily give pupils the time to develop that in a way that is appropriate, whether that means because our handwriting lessons are too short, or they perhaps in some cases not long enough, or we don't necessarily, particularly since the sort of pandemic, loads of reception teachers are finding out that intake after intake they don't necessarily have those communication skills because they've been on phones for a lot. Now, if they've been on the phone, that probably means that they haven't necessarily been, crawling around. And like the act of crawling is really good for your upper body strength, which is really important for writing as well. So, people then, where children and their muscular skeletal functions aren't prepared for it, writing then becomes a painful activity because they can't do it. And so if that's the case, that writing is painful, then there's not much incentive for them to think I should carry on doing this because this is interesting.
So you've almost got this compounding by a really complex domain. It takes a lot of effort anyway, and a system that's not necessarily set up to provide the optimum conditions for that learning to take place. And so you can see why so many children struggle.
Yeah.
Even just through the physiological aspect alone, never mind the fact that we are pushing them into too soon and we are sort of having these biases when it comes to assessment. And so
definitely. And I think what's really kind of opened my eyes is that whatever your provision for handwriting is, if it doesn't, and usually these handwriting programs sort of start around year 1, but if there isn't anything there to address the physiological, then you're building on quicksand, really. And so there are programs out there that do understand the importance of upper body strength and your body being ready for handwriting. And so it's definitely not saying throw out what you have, but look at those programs and try to incorporate as much of that aspect, that physiological aspect, as you can in early years. I feel like getting your PE teachers involved and understanding the kinds of things that they could be doing that are going to improve their readiness for handwriting as well. Really important stuff that doesn't take more time from an already crowded timetable.
I'm afraid all the PE teachers are too busy teaching maths lessons, so unfortunately they won't be able to help at this moment.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, so this could be a really important chapter in what could potentially be a really important book. I'm looking forward to reading it, but this could be, the thing that gets you on the main stage or the main hall at a research ed, Neil. I mean, it depends how far this extends into secondary's radar.
Shannon's does laugh at me and be like, you do really find like the really niche-y sort of things to do. And I do, but the niche are important. But on that note, I think that's important to say, there are definitely aspects here that are important for the secondary school colleague. So I'm sure your listeners will have heard Chris talk a lot about reading fluency, and there is an element of fluency within handwriting as well. And it's not like handwriting fluency sort of stops at year 3. I think it actually goes, this again, another study by Graham found that actually sort of handwriting fluency sort of plateaus at around year 10. And there are sort of quite a lot of studies where they do draw correlation between sort of outcomes within sort of different different subjects to the number of words that children can write per minute. So the more number of words you can write per minute, the better outcomes that you get across a load of subjects. And if, as the research seems to suggest, that children progressively get quicker in their handwriting fluency up until around the ages of 15, then and with the presentation effect as well, it's not just a sort of a primary issue. There are really sort of big some really crucial takeaways for our secondary colleagues, in that spending some time practicing handwriting, again, correlational, but obviously it makes sense. If they can write more fluently and they can write more, then the quality of the answers that they're going to give are going to be superior, because they can hopefully write more stuff about what they're meant to be writing about. So that could be the difference between classic 3-point answer where you need to make 3 separate points, and if your your working memory is taken up so much by thinking about handwriting too much, you're not going to make those points because your working memory is going to think about it, and you don't have the speed to do it in because of the confines of an exam in the case of secondary. So whilst on the sort of the surface, I appreciate this is in a book entitled primary literacy, there are definitely still what I hope are some takeaways for our secondary colleagues. And again, it is a developmental process. So in the same with reading, if you have children who can't read in year 7, you can't just get them to read. You have to work out, is it a phonics, is it a fluency, and provide the correct intervention. And I hope the book, sort of my chapter, sort of gets that across as well, and that if you do have this situation where children aren't writing fluently enough, then actually, well, first of all, we sort of discuss, should you actually be tracking writing fluency? I think it's probably no bad thing, given the other state of sort of other, and how subjective other writing assessments can be. How many words can you write if you've sort of spent a whole term memorizing, say, a poem, and then you just go to the kids, okay, this poem off by heart, write this poem, right? You have 1 minute, write as much of the poem down as you can, in a way that's still legible. You actually get some quantitative data from what is usually considered quite a subjective area, which I think is potentially quite interesting as well. So definitely not saying that people have to, but if they want to as well, there are strategies around what assessment of handwriting might assessment of handwriting might look like in this chapter too.
I think it will. I think I wasn't being flippant. I think it will be really important. I've definitely seen 16-year-olds with what I would consider immature grips, or adopting an immature grip when writing the answers to maths questions. And so I think it will be front and center on everyone's mind. And this week, Peps was talking about distractions, wasn't he? The aftermath, the wake of distractions in his newsletter. And I think if your hand's sore, that's a distraction. And I think the gist was, once one distraction is in the door, then it's very difficult to put Pandora back in the box, or whatever. I don't know, was Pandora in the box, or was it just loads of stuff in the box?
Yeah, no, Pandora was not in the box. Pandora provided the box, if memory serves me right. If my Greek mythology, my mythos is up to scratch.
No, I'm pretty sure I knew that too on some level, but it felt better to say Pandora back in the box. There's something more elegant about that. But everyone, far too far digressing. But once you're distracted, and you're not going to be undistracted. So I remember being in university tests, and my handwriting had slipped because you don't write as much every day, and I remember being in pain. We had these massive essay questions to write, and you had to reference multiple sources and things like that there, and so I can see why it'd be important as much in secondary school as it would be in primary school.
Yeah, and you definitely see it still, I think, towards the end of primary school, when year 5, year 6, you've got to get those extended pieces of writing done, and it's, you've perhaps structured your sequence of lessons in a way that pupils have, maybe 15, 20 minutes of independent writing before you move on to the next section. Within 5 minutes, some of them are there, as if their hands are on fire, and going, or me my hand hurts, which is, shouldn't be the case after just sort of 5 minutes of writing at least.
No, well, that's a different conversation because maybe we can nudge practice towards efficient writing tasks as opposed to 6-page essays that no one's ever really going to read. That's not for another time. So, I think this has been fascinating. I'm really interested to see if you guys have changed anything at STEP or if you plan to change anything at STEP as a result. But are there any guiding principles we can discern from the research in terms of how we can teach handwriting to our pupils?
Yeah, so there are a couple of sort of key things that we can use. So one is this idea of, and most people sort of will probably be familiar with something like this, like this idea of like numbered arrows. So what would tend to happen is like there'll be a worked example, say, of a letter that they're probably working on, and then there'll be some arrows next to those letters that are numbered to kind of suggest where children should start, and usually that arrow represents the sort of the motion that children should be making as well. So Berninger found that those were pretty useful. So if you can, definitely sort of include those. There's lots of ideas about so performance versus learning as well. So that the Robert Bjork and Alderson sort of firmly put that on the map, but there is evidence around how there is a Goldilocks zone between doing so much of it is not effective and doing some of it sort of isn't effective. So you don't need to do too much of it, and it's better to be little and often than this sort of mass sort of practice way of doing it as well. Sort of combining modalities, so visual and motor. So in this case, so in this particular study, they compared those that had visual or motor and visual and motor, so sort of 3 groups. The visual group was sort of presented with static images of letter formation. The motor group were able to view sort of motion models, so instead of just static images that were happening, literal sort of shorthand videos of certain letters being created. And it'll probably come as no surprise to people that combining modalities is sort of really important as well. So being able to then for pupils to be able to see the static image of these sort of letters being created and generated, as well as seeing then that sort of the whole process being communicated as well, is really important. Probably shouldn't have been that surprising, but I think I probably could be something that perhaps doesn't get looked at, is the idea of actually handwriting practice being a combination of, yes, you need to practice the letter, but then you also need to practice your handwriting at the word level, and then you need to practice your handwriting at the sentence level as well. This idea that it should just be confined or restricted to just, okay, now I want you to do like a whole line of L's or M's, or even a couple of different letters. That's certainly an important aspect of it as well, but actually good handwriting practice, and certainly what researchers suggest, actually you get children to sort of practice their handwriting at those sort of 3 different levels. So yes, you obviously need to practice the letter, but don't then sort of forget the word and the sentence level as well. So which is certainly something that perhaps I thought, perhaps I would have assumed that transferability was sort of more of a given rather than something that actually children need to actually have the time to practice on. So yeah, so I think certainly this idea that performance versus learning, very much still a thing. Multiple modalities, really important. So show them the static sort of being built up over time, and sort of different images. Show them videos of it happening, and don't forget to practice at these sort of three fundamental levels. Those were sort of the main sort of takeaways from this.
If you could go into Tim and say, right, Tim, we need to revolutionize how handwriting is taught in our schools, what would that look like? Would it be a case of taking, teacher expertise, doing different bits, or would you build these into like a guided sequence or anything? What would you do?
The simple answer is that there is a program out there called Kinetic Letters. Claire Seeley has talked about this. Andrew Percival have talked about this a lot. Now, I knew of Kinetic Letters, but I hadn't really looked into it that much prior to me starting all this sort of reading. But Margaret, who runs the show over there, I thought I knew things about handwriting, and I had a conversation with her after I'd written all of this, and everything I was talking about, she knew, and then some. And so the program of Kinetic Letters has really sort of embedded sort of all these principles and more in terms of getting children to be as fluent as possible, but they need to be as legible as possible. What's the best way to do that? And if you're looking for what can we do, if people are still looking for, okay, I've persuaded people that actually handwriting is really important, so let's focus on handwriting. What can we get with some external training and a program to follow? I would definitely argue Kinetic Letters. Full disclosure, I don't mention, the chapter doesn't mention Kinetic Letters at all in its entirety, and sort of that was sort of done purposefully so that people could come to their own thoughts and processes about what they wanted out of this chapter. But if people do want a sort of plug and play, then Kinetic Letters for sure. Other than that, as I say, it would just be looking at what your current provision looks like. Again, sort of handwriting does get have a bit of a bad reputation in terms of how much time is actually spent on it. It's generally not, it's more about, can the children read? Can they read fluently? And are they, actually writing things? And we kind of forget about, as with sort of reading, there is, processes before the can they just write an output. You need to make sure that they're ready for that. So I'm hoping that there's enough here that would mean that if you've listened to the podcast, sort of the extra tip is, if you want something that's done to a really high standard already, Kinetic Letters, but there's enough in there in this chapter to get you to think about your provision and how you can adapt it to make sure that children are ready for it.
And the great thing about Tadape, as we don't take sponsorship from anyone, we can recommend Margaret and her Kinetic Letters work as much as we want, without any feelings of guilt. We're not going to start talking about our favorite coffee manufacturers for the next 5 minutes. So I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. If I could sum up the chat, handwriting is extremely important, both neurologically and cognitively, particularly with the link to memory. It's an immensely complex domain, compounded by the system in which we try to teach it.
Yeah.
And if we are to think about our practice and the things that we should have at the fore of our minds when we're thinking about our handwriting instruction, numbered arrows, the Goldilocks zone of little and often, combining the visual and motor modalities, and leveling our letter, word, and sentence level handwriting practice. Do you reckon that's a good summary of everything we've discussed in the last hour or so?
It's like you've put it into a large language model and asked it to summarize the last hour or so, Kieran. Such was the expertise of that summarization there.
Yeah, well, watch this space, because we know the speed at which artificial intelligence is moving. And I, for one, welcome our robotic overlords.
So as I mentioned, always make sure when you're prompting, you say please and thank you, because I'm sure they'll remember that afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I've scolded a few in the past when they've been really wrong, so
just not gone.
Oh, I mean, I'm looking forward to reading the chapter. I mean, I think it's meant to be out round about now, isn't it? It may even be out. I heard the 26th of June, but I don't know when books are published.
Yeah, not sure. I haven't heard that it is out yet, but I'm sure it won't be long because I know that we want to do a research ed primary, a special one that focuses just on that. Again, I think hopefully I'll be able to present these ideas there as well, and hopefully you'll be there talking all things primary maths.
Yeah, well, we do have a date for that, don't we? 23rd November, and the
23rd
call for
November.
speakers is out there. And I think, this is, the Venn diagram with TDAPE listeners and Research Head Primary. There's got to be huge overlap there in that Venn diagram. So, if you're thinking, oh, I'd love to speak, but it's not the thing I do, now is your chance because
Yeah,
it's 5 primary teachers, 4 primary teachers. I think second teacher will learn a lot, but in terms of research ed, it's can we engage the primary community in my mind? And I think this is the opportunity. So it's on their Twitter. Get on the form. It's not a long form. It doesn't even require a fully formed proposal, just a title and an overview of what you're going to talk about. I've made some demands in my proposal form. So as long as they are satisfied, then I will be there talking about the research into counting, which is something I've been working on in the background.
looking forward to that. Not for research ed primary, but for research ed Surrey, I too have put some perfectly reasonable demands in the application form that Jack sent through with regards to whether there was any sort of special requests that I had. Really going down the was it Eddie Van Halen?
The
Who
brown
wrote
M&Ms.
Yeah, brown M&Ms, not because he was a diva and wanted brown M&Ms, but it's all about the detail of the contract and how much of a close read those did. Because if there were no brown M&Ms in his bowl, then he was, assured that everything else would have been as required, which I think is a pretty good idea. So yeah.
Or Jack. He actually gave me brown M&Ms last time.
You did, didn't you? You did it. I think that's why I did it, because I was like, oh, yeah, you did it, didn't you? So I was like, okay, I'll carry on this
It
joke.
was a really big bag too. I was eating it for weeks.
Excellent.
Fantastic. Well, all I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me, Kieran.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.